Okay, let me live here. We should be live here. I'm just gonna wait for our Instagram to come up. There we go. Got everything on your end?
Oh yeah, we're good here.
Fantastic. Well, what a wild time, huh? So I don't know if people know this. When we picked this topic, we did not know who was going to be the winner of the election. So when we picked this topic, we were just thinking, hey, this is good for anyone to know, regardless who wins. But obviously, with the current elected president, it does add a little bit more to this, and so we thought it'd be a really fun topic, and we really hope a lot of people are interested in coming in. It doesn't matter what state you're from; obviously, anyone could be affected, and so we're gonna kind of talk about how things can affect it, what type of things you need to be worried about or not worried about, and so Dr. Sam, one of the things I thought was really interesting was not just how does the president affect it, but kind of like, even if they wanted to do things, so that'd be great for us to talk about. Like, what if someone wanted to do something? Like,
Right,
what if Trump or someone wanted to make a national
right.
abortion ban? Like, is it even possible and stuff like that? And so I think it would be great to kind of talk about stuff that egg freezing. I've had a couple patients recently was worried about with egg freezing, if that's going to affect them. And then I thought another thing was interesting is California, usually being the first one to do things, went and passed a law mandating fertility, IVF. And so I thought, it'd be kind of neat too to talk about that, because obviously both candidates talked about, making IVF mandated. And so it'd be kind of interesting. And so, like I said, love to kind of hear your 2 cents on this. And then what we'll do is we'll get, we got someone in the background already that we'll bring on to
Yeah.
see what questions they have. But, what do you think? I mean, what's your first thing you would tell everyone?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest thing here that strikes me right away in this election, as opposed to previous elections, I mean, we're fertility doctors, you and I, so we've been paying very close attention to anything that's ever said publicly, politically about IVF for years. And it's usually kind of a sleeper topic, honestly. I mean, I think there's a little bit of controversy in the background among some groups, maybe some, specific religious groups have a position on it, but most people just kind of let it go to the background. Or and for the first time, certainly this is the first time that I can remember, and I kind of looked into this. It was the first time that it was actually something that was brought up in a presidential debate, and it was something that was brought up in town halls. And both candidates from the Republican Party as well as the Democratic Party were speaking about it very enthusiastically, proposing really audacious policy changes. I mean, Trump, of course, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, has proposed a national program for IVF, and he's proposed a couple different ways in which that could happen through his lens. Others have proposed other things, but of course on the ballot there were a lot of other really interesting things protecting women's rights, and we've seen a lot of interest generated around propositions that were on the ballot. Definitely a big one here in Arizona that was passed. And so I think this is going to be a really great topic tonight to get a chance to kind of talk about it, you and I. But I'm also really curious to hear what people are interested in,
Yeah.
from our perspective too. What are folks out there interested in understanding from a fertility doctor's perspective? Please come on, ask us these questions,
Yeah.
and we'll tackle them.
I think one thing that is pretty easy that we can kind of get rid of right from the beginning is none of this, doesn't matter who won, will ever affect egg freezing and sperm freezing. That was something I was surprised to hear a patient say, is that they were like, oh, I'm worried, am I going to be able to freeze my eggs after this? Or, this is my last time. It surprised me a little bit because, for us, we know that people
Mm,
lose eggs every month, right? People lose
right.
sperm, unexpectedly. And so it would be very unusual for there to be legislation that would stop eggs from being frozen, because there's literally no ethical dilemma there. And so I think that's one thing I definitely wanted people to know tonight is you don't have to worry about, eggs being frozen or sperm being frozen. At least, again, I can't even see a situation where that would come up. Just between you and I, just kind of interested. What do you think? Like, if let's say, let's think of like best case scenarios, worst case scenarios, right? So best case scenario is that let's say IVF does get passed and Trump decides to do it now, like he said, we'll find if he follows through on that. You and I have talked about this before, that from a legislation standpoint, he still has to have Congress to be able to do that, and then the question is, how do they push that on to companies, and so, just like when it comes to things like requiring maternity leave, you can't just push on everyone. So it's going to be certain companies with a certain size, just like California did. They said it had to be a company of 100 above. And then the question is when it's created, these laws, how ambiguous they are, right? So one of the things is like, okay, so they create this. What are some of the problems that could be wrong? And so I was talking to someone about this today, where I said, just because they say IVF has to be done doesn't mean does it have to be 100% free? Does it mean that they'll pay 10%? Does it mean that, there's parts to it, right? Because even some of the companies you and I work with that say it's all included, still people pay co-pays, things like that. And so just wondering, best case scenario, if IVF is approved across the country and everyone's, able to get IVF now, where do you see some of the obstacles yourself, or like, have you seen already in certain things where it's mandated?
Yeah. I mean, and I to your last point there, Dr. Ian, was like, let's highlight that one for a second, because it already exists in, states throughout the country where IVF is mandated. And so, for example, in Massachusetts, that's kind of the classic example that comes to mind, where, IVF is mandated. There are some guardrails around it, but by and large, everybody has access to IVF if they, fulfill a diagnosis of infertility. And I think what's really interesting there is, if we explore that on a whole national level, the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is cost. I mean, this is a pretty costly thing to just roll out to everybody. And I've seen some estimates out there from some think tanks that would put the number at around $7 billion. So that's the first big thing that kind of jumps out at me. That's roughly the cost of our federal program for public housing. That's a big line item. The other thing that's interesting here is, hey, does this change behavior, right? Like, if people know they've got IVF, is there a world in which people start to wait a little bit longer to have their children? They're like, well, if I struggle, I could always do IVF. Is there, kind of a over reliance on fertility treatment? And you and I both know very well, the older you get, the less effective IVF gets. So does that balloon the costs up even more? And then I think there's another point, and you touched on this, and I'd love to hear more about this, is this idea of like, compelling taxpayers or maybe religious entities and employers to subsidize a program that maybe they don't agree with. And I think that's where, the rubber starts hitting the road on kind of making it sort of either mandated, which is one model, saying the insurance companies have to pay for it. And then the other one, which he very interestingly said, hey, the federal government is actually going to subsidize this, which would, by all measures, be very, very costly. Now, could it be done? Yes. In some places, it's already being done.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you exactly what you were saying. I think it's gonna be tricky. I think it's a very easy promise to give. I think it's gonna be very hard to execute. One of the things that Trump can do is immediately he could make it a federal law. So then that way, anyone that works for the government, military, that could go through, and he could actually do that unopposed. That you wouldn't need Congress to really do that. That would be something he could do with the executive order. He could not do that for the rest of the nation, and that wouldn't be possible with an executive order. And so that's where we would need legislation to go through to allow that. And but the thing that I've seen where even when you have it, it's not always what you think it is. Meaning, if you go to an IVF place right now, you can walk in and go, I want to do IVF. You don't have to have a reason. You can be like, I want to pick gender. I just want to do it because I don't want to do anything else. And no one can stop you. But when you have insurance, there's rules, right? And so like recently, like you and I talked about how where we had to change our policy of just letting people have choice to put back 2 embryos, these companies put pressure on us. And if you don't think that when there's government behind and ever being enforced, there will be pressures. And there's going to be pressures like you're not going to be able to put your embryos back. There's going to be pressures on, hey, you have to go through these hoops first and have to do a bunch of IUIs first. Or maybe, you know, I've seen things where people, because they've had their tubes tied, or if let's say they've had a vasectomy, now they won't cover them. And so the problem is that these things are great. And obviously I'm excited about my wife and I wish they were there when we were there. But it's one of those things where a lot of my patients from California are asking me like, hey, when I have this coverage, should we have coverage? I said, we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know. It's a little ambiguous. We don't know if they're going to say, we'll give you $1,000 budget. And you're like, well, yeah, they said I could do up to 3 cycles. But, you know, when you make the bill a little bit ambiguous, you know, companies find ways to get around things. And so I always tell people, I think there's going to be iterations of this. I think there's going to be the first iteration. People are like, oh, that didn't work. Everyone found ways around. Then they're going to make a second iteration and so forth. Eventually, you know, I do see this coming. I knew this was coming. I've been saying this for 5 years. It was eventually going to happen. And I'm excited that both candidates were at least considering it. And I'm hoping that now the one that's in there actually follows through on it. And since both said it, I feel like there should be support from both sides of the aisle to make this happen. You know, I guess we'll see what that happens. I see we already have someone there, and I'd love to get questions. And like I said, you and I can talk as much of one layer. So let's start. I got to see Joanne here. I'm going to put her on the stage.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I was just talking about you and the thing we were talking about, California.
Yeah, so I guess I've already heard you address part of my question, but I was just wondering, like, so I'm a travel patient from Northern California. I specifically chose New Directions because of, you know, Dr. Amos on the Talk About Tuesday podcast. I could sense that there's rapport that I could have and also the CDC success rates. So I think for me, like, you know, I have DOR. I'm probably going to be looking at cycles into next year. And so there's the Senate bill in California, Senate Bill 729 that passed in September. That's going to provide some level of coverage um, from you know workplaces that offer coverage for over 100 people. It was just enacted. There's a lot of vagaries in the bill. I guess as a provider, I just want to know, like how I'm assuming that a lot of people will be pouring into the clinic for IVF and IUI services. How do you plan to manage like a huge stream of patients coming in? How will you manage waiting lists? Will existing patients, you know, still have kind of priority to services or like I guess I know that the bill has a lot of vagaries, but what will you do to ensure that people will have service essentially?
Yeah, great
absolutely.
question.
You want to start with that, Dr. Sam?
Yeah, maybe I'll just do the intro. And I know Dr. Amos always thinking big picture about, you know, clinic flow and how you really optimize and make sure everybody has access. Access is the name of what we are passionate about. You know, I just want to talk about Senate Bill 729 for a quick second. So first of all, you know, this was passed, but it's not enacted yet. So there is some you know, kind of legal legislative issues that still have to happen before it goes into effect in July of 2025. The other part is it only covers employers that have at least 100 people. That's, you know, that's a fair size business. So at the end of the day, I think this covers about 9 million Californians in basically large group state regulated health plans. It doesn't apply to people that get coverage again from religious employers, Medi-Cal, things of that type. So you've got quite a few exclusions. And then the really interesting thing is how they wrote the legislation. They said a maximum of 3 egg retrievals, I believe, and unlimited embryo transfers. And if there's anything I know about the government is that nothing is unlimited. So, you know, I think that this law is going to be pruned. And I think this legislation is just going through an early iteration. I can't imagine that they're just going to kind of open up their pocketbooks and say, yep, whatever an IVF practice charges for 3 egg retrievals and unlimited transfers, we're going to be happy to do that. The other question is, when do they stop? When that person has achieved a pregnancy, do they stop when they've banked enough embryos to fulfill their desires for their whole family building journey? These are things that have not been addressed yet. And those are the types of conversations that we have with our patients, of course. Like, do you want to bank embryos? Do you want to start transferring now? What's the goal here? So I will say, like, just at face value, I don't think the legislation as it is written today will stand when it actually goes into effect. The broader thing here is I am very happy that we're expanding access. Like, this is what we want. Dr. Amos and I talk every day about how can we get more people to be able to benefit from this amazing technology. So I think with that in mind, maybe I'll pass it over to you, Dr. Amos, to talk about how you think about these things, especially as we have something like this coming down the pipeline.
Yeah, I think one thing that comes up is this question of like, hey, how are we going to be able to handle this? Like, as all of a sudden they're going to be pouring in IVF. And I think the first thing to understand is that there really aren't that many people who aren't getting IVF who want IVF. Now, there's a lot of people, it's too expensive and sure they don't go through. But when you actually look at the data, it's not like 50% of people who need IVF never go on to do it. It's not that high. And so I don't think it's going to open up the woodworks completely. And then as Dr. Salem was saying, I do think there's going to be, as I said, these iterations. I feel like what's going to happen is I think there's going to be people who will fight the law. I think there are going to be people who will find ways around it. If everyone remembers when we had the ACA passed, places found ways to get around it. Like, well, how can we say we have insurance but not have insurance? And then they made all these big insurance things where they were, kind of like Christian care. And then that way they didn't get their tax for not having insurance. So the thing that Dr. Salem says is absolutely correct is, businesses will try to find ways around it. It's going to happen. And so there's going to be these iterations. And the other thing that I think is a good thing to talk about, and this would be a great question, Joanna, if you have for us, is this has been done. So as Dr. Salem said, in like Massachusetts, Illinois, and there are some limitations. For a long time, again, you had to go through hoops. There are restrictions on it. So, for example, like someone who has severe diminished ovarian reserve, sometimes you don't qualify. So that's the hard part when you have this kind of top-down pushing it, is that there are these rules, and
Yeah.
that's where I get a little bit concerned sometimes. I know people in these other states. I know you won't have any issue going to another state. That shouldn't be a problem as long as the insurance is covered there. And I don't think there's going to be an accessibility issue. I was telling you about that. And that's because there will be clinics that are used to doing, let's say, 5 patients maybe a month. They're going to struggle because if the volume comes in, they're going to struggle. So if you look at all these states, Illinois, Massachusetts, the clinics are high volume clinics. And so places that don't have high volume, they will struggle. And you're right, it's probably going to go further and further out with those cycles. But clinics like ourselves, clinics like Boston IVF, Spring, some of these ones are used to high volume. It won't be tough for them. They'll be able to get people in, at the same rate because we're used to that. So it's only those kind of clinics that are a little bit smaller, I think, will have that problem. But I'd like to know, Joanne, with the question I have for you is, as a patient, or even as just a consumer in California, how do you think the law is going to be? Like, when you look at it in your mind, do you see it as this, like, everything's covered, medications, IVF, testing? Like, how do you see it?
So I think for me, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I I'm a nervous person, and so for every like hope that this is going to work out, I have 10 hesitancies, especially after the election. I wonder, kind of irrationally, if this could just all go away tomorrow, just even the promise of Senate Bill 729. I know that's not rational, but I think for me, like, if I could even get one retrieval out of it, that's literally like 10K, 20K, 30K in my pocket that I could be using to build a life, to put down a mortgage. And so even though I have skepticism when I think about, are they going to include 3 cycles? But even including one would be moving the needle forward hugely for
Mhm.
families. So I'm excited for that, and I'm hopeful that this will work out in the next couple of years, even if it takes a couple of iterations.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for your question. And we're going to talk a little bit more about it as we go. But thank you again.
Yeah, thank you for
Yeah.
that. And one other little comment on that part, Dr. Aim, was like, you know, the U.S. healthcare system, as we know, is its own beast, right? Like we live, breathe, eat this thing. It is very different than other healthcare systems, but this is not unusual for other healthcare systems. In Europe, in Australia, there are, in Japan, there are multiple systems in which we see, a government mandate or a federally subsidized IVF program. They've struggled in different ways in different programs, and I'll just give like one or two examples. Like, for example, in the UK, they've struggled with volume. Like, there's more people that want to get into the IVF clinics than there are spaces to do it. And so people actually have benefits to use in the public system, but then go outside of it and use it in the private system because the clinics in their regions fill up quickly. And in other regions, in other places, uh, IVF is highly standardized, meaning it's not personalized in the same way that we currently do it right now, with the idea of, hey, success rates are going to be lower, which they are broadly. The success rates are lower in Europe than in the US. And part of that is because they have to kind of standardize certain things to get enough people, through in the same way. And that might not optimize each and every cycle as much. I know that's a controversial point, but I'll just throw that out there. But yeah.
Yeah, you bring a really good point. I mean, when I was in Minnesota, and I'm sure when you were there too, I mean, we saw people come from Canada all the time and would pay cash because they didn't wait. One thing that occurs in Canada is that they do have fertility coverage, but they don't allow things like family balancing. And so we see people all the time coming from Canada, even though they have coverage there and they come here. Sometimes the rates aren't as good, and so people come here. So you bring a really good point, and that's kind of the point I was saying about clearly any benefit is a benefit, but there's going to be certain restrictions, and that's the thing is that you know I'm not so as I mentioned for this point, I was not worried about our clinic being able to take the volume, but I think you're right. I think some of the places in California are going to struggle. I think they're going to get too busy, and then people are going to want to do one of two things. They're either going to want to go to a clinic with that personalized care, which is a little bit slower, and they're like, "Hey, I'd rather pay for that to have that," or they'll go, "Nope, I'll go through the system." One of the things that's interesting, though, that I'm sure you are aware of is that it's interesting, and I love economics, and so when you see a system like this, there's is a form of economics, right? There's going on here, and so one of the things that's interesting about this is that in Arizona, they had it where we have access, which is Medicaid, and they went and if you make it free, people just come like crazy to the clinic. It doesn't matter. They're like, oh, I got people here, and they come to the clinic. So they said, let's just make it $1, a copay $1, just to see what will happen. And what was amazing is it lowered the amount of people coming to the clinics because they're like, hey, now I have to put something into this. And so why I bring this up is this same idea is, I'm sure you've seen this, that there are people who have insurance coverage where everything's free, and they'll go through multiple cycles. And that starts to, have costs in the system even though they don't need all those cycles. They're like, hey, it doesn't cost anything. I'll go through 3. And then they save up all these embryos. And so there's been backlash from some of these companies now where they're like, okay, wait, you can't go through multiple cycles. Now you have to only, if you have an embryo, you have to put it back first before you go through. And this is that thing I was saying about those iterations. It's going to change. And every time you change one thing, there's a balance, and that's the economics of everything. And so we're going to see that in this when this happens, and we'll eventually find out where it stands. So I see we have another person here, and I know we have a couple here. So let's bring up this next person, Crystal. We're going to bring you to the stage and see what questions you have for us. Hey,
Hello,
Crystal,
guys.
how are you
Hey,
doing?
I was good. I've been following this whole like debate thing and everything, and especially because of fertility. But I was wondering, do you guys think it will affect surrogates as well?
That's a great question.
That's a
I
great
don't know
question.
if that's come up very much about
Yeah.
surrogates. I mean, you know, I know everyone says it's going to become the Handmaid's Tale. So, I mean, based off of that, maybe, but hopefully we won't all lose our reproductive ability and have to go to that. I haven't heard anything about concerns of using surrogates. Have you, Dr. Salem?
No, that doesn't seem like it's been something that's come up. I know this is, again, this is a hugely controversial aspect from like a lot of religious groups that has over time, been expressed from their endpoint, personal ethical things. I think, again, this is a great point that you bring up though, Crystal, because classic example of something that is extraordinarily expensive and has a very real medical indication. But if you don't have guardrails on it, then the expenditures for health insurance companies, employers, fertility benefits providers is going to just balloon. And so, they're going to have to think about these tough questions.
Yeah, I agree, Dr. Sam. I think there's going to have to be some laws eventually. I have seen concerns about the fact that people getting paid for it. There's this kind of concern of like, hey, how much is someone allowed to get paid for that? Then the people making money off of setting it up between them, and even just the idea of this excessive cost. Eventually maybe someone needs to come in and curbside this and say, hey, we can't make it this expensive. Because realistically, the group that hurts the most is really gay men. I mean, realistically, I mean, at least if you are in a same-sex relationship and you're a female, it's not that hard to get sperm. It's expensive, but not that expensive. But if you are the same-sex male couple, I mean, you're talking about almost no chance of having kids unless you have a friend who's going to carry for you, or you got $200,000 sitting around. And so one of the things people don't realize about when you are a surrogate is your insurance usually doesn't allow you to use your insurance for the pregnancy. And so the other couple has to even get a whole other insurance out. And then if you have a C-section, it costs more. If you get bed rest, it costs more. So I would be interested to find out if that's the next way this goes down with legislation, that they make and say, hey, insurances have to cover for surrogates. You can't make it, and then make it more accessible to people. So a great question, Crystal.
Thank you. That's all I was just wondering because I've been following this whole thing and I'm like just praying and praying and a lot has been going on here. So I'm just like just been praying and hoping to find somebody. And I did find somebody. So I'm hoping that she's actually with Dr. Salem right now. So we're praying that she'll take it, and then after hers, it will be me. So crossing fingers that this whole debate and whole everything goes the way I want it to.
Absolutely.
Well, we'll be crossing our fingers for you, Crystal. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Bye.
Bye. So I see we have another person here as well, and we'll get to that. It's interesting. One of the questions someone asked here as well was this, will any of this affect donor embryos or donor eggs? That kind of came up from Amanda. And, it goes, I think eggs, I can't imagine it affecting, meaning like worrying about things like laws against eggs. But, this is something, again, where you go back to this fertility coverage, right? I mean, yeah, IVF is great for people who can do IVF. What about people who can't?
Yeah.
What about same-sex couples who need sperm? Is it going to cover that? That's the thing about these laws is that they're looking at the majority, and I understand the majority is going to be, just needing an IVF or something like that. But it's interesting, I think I'm hoping that it will allow them to use donor eggs. That will make them more accessible. With donor embryos, that's interesting because I feel like there's almost no one against donor embryos, meaning that's what people prefer. They would actually say, no, I don't want you to throw away embryos. I would rather you donate them to someone else. So I don't see a lot of problems with that. The hardest part with donor embryos, I know that clinics run into, is the legality, the concerns. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm kind of thinking through this. I mean, I think the biggest things that we'll see in the donor world, because let's be honest, it's an industry, right? Like the donor, there are, commercial donor egg banks, commercial donor sperm banks, and they provide a very good service. I don't want to take anything away from that. But what we've seen is as demand has increased, supply has stayed constrained, price has gone up, basic economic stuff. And so like what I can imagine though, is that if you have, a new fixed payer, like what we see with Medicare, for example, or if there's legislation around this kind of stuff, I think we'll see downwards pressure on the cost of donor eggs, donor sperm, et cetera, which I think is a great thing. I think if there's a way that we can get good quality, donor sperm, donor egg. I mean, some of the donor egg banks charge outrageous amounts for what they're providing. They're providing a good service, but could the cost be something that is worked on? I think so, and I think this would be a positive. Yeah, I think this would be a positive aspect.
Yeah, I mean, for us, it's 6 eggs, including transfer, everything, for 12,000 something. Like I mean, it can go down. It's just that unfortunately, there are some costs that may go up. We're gonna get to Rebecca here in a second, but before we do, I just want to point out that someone here is a lawyer and says they're glad we're having this conversation. I would love for you to come on this, and we would love to have a lawyer perspective and find out. We're doing our best to try to say what we think legally, but I'd love to also hear your perspective as well. So if you're still watching and have that, then maybe you can come on as well and talk to people and answer questions. So anyways, let's go to Rebecca here. She's sitting in the background. We'll hear what she has to say. Hey, Rebecca.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Fantastic.
You actually helped me have our first baby back in COVID times.
Aww, how sweet.
Hello.
But I just was interested in all the conversation. I don't know if I had a specific question. I missed the first 30 minutes of it, but I just am very interested to kind of see where this is going to go and how IVF gets covered, if it gets covered, what it will cover, like you were talking about. Will it cover donors? Will it cover a surrogate? So just here for all the information and the feedback. I don't think I had a specific thing. I just was interested in the topic.
What concerns do you have, or things are you looking for? Like, even though you might have a specific question, you obviously are watching this because you have concerns and you have, questions you probably wanted to get answered.
Right. Husband's got him. I don't want you to think I'm just letting him cry in the background. I guess, so we've done IVF. For us, it took quite a few tries. And I just am wondering if we have, Ryan had insurance. Luckily, my husband through work, but we hit our lifetime maximum with that insurance. Is it like you get one shot, and when you have unexplained infertility and you have to go through so much, it could be this, it could be that, to figure out what's going on. I'm wondering, is there going to be a maximum, I guess? If you were lucky enough to have kids already, are you still going to get the opportunity to have coverage, or is it no, you got your miracle, that's good for you? So I guess that would be my biggest concern is it going to still be able to help families that if you're wanting to have another baby, is that going to be something that's in the cards for you? And if so, how much is it going to cover? Because there's so much that goes into IVF. It's not necessarily just the egg retrieval and the PGS testing and the storing and all of, it's just so much. I'm wondering how they're going to word it and what exactly it's going to cover for everybody, because more often than not in stories you hear from people, it's not just a very easy fix. It goes pretty in depth with figuring it out of how to help have a baby.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for your question. We'll talk about that. It made me think of things while you were talking. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you again.
Absolutely.
I love that. I love getting to see her baby there. I love that.
Oh my God. It's always, when people tell me, like, oh, I didn't want to bring the baby. I'm like, no, bring the baby. I would love to see the baby. She brought up a couple, when she was talking, I started thinking about things. And one of my thoughts I was thinking in my head is, and I'm sure you've seen this before, when a couple has insurance, and they both have fertility coverage, what's weird is everything goes through the female, right? And which is strange because, you know, a guy can have fertility coverage, but if she doesn't have fertility coverage, or their partner per se, now they don't have coverage. And so I wonder how that would work in that system, because I've seen many times where like someone's, let's say, had Intel, but their partner's not on the same insurance, but because it's on the guy's side, they're like, well, we won't cover it. And they're like, but that's their partner. Their infertility is both of them, right? It's not a one person thing. It's and so it kind of made me wonder, like, how will they work around that? You know, the other question that came up in my mind is two things where she was talking about having another kid is that, let's say you go through fertility because you know you have infertility, you have to do IVF, you have a baby, you get divorced.
Yeah.
Does it keep with you? Is it 3 times lifetime forever? Does a new relationship count again? And just so people understand, like, I think when you think about economics, this is something I don't think we think about, is that if it becomes more accessible, let's say that, you know, currently when people do research and look and find out like how many people are not doing IVF because they can't afford it, there might be people who never even started the process because of cost, right? So once it gets opened up, it might open up. And let's say the floodgates open. Well, one of the things that comes up then is that usually with insurances, they offer less. They'll sometimes offer less. And then a lot of clinics will say, well, then we won't take insurance. And so there is this kind of economics of, you can make the companies give fertility coverage, but you can't always make the clinics want to take the coverage.
Right.
I mean, I don't know how legally they can do that. Hopefully our lawyer here will come on and tell us if legally they can, but I don't think they can legally make sure, say, no, you have to take this coverage. Now they may want to, because again, of things, but it's just interesting how all that, you know, will change. One of the things I wanted to talk about tonight, and I know we still have Dakota on here that we're going to bring on here in a bit, was, so we were talking about some of the good things, you know, getting IVF coverage. So what is your thought? You know, I heard politicians say this, and I know you and I probably don't believe this, but we're like, Trump is going to make a national abortion ban, or Trump is going to get rid of IVF, you know, as what the fear was. And it's interesting because a lot of people believe it. And I think one thing that's important for people to understand is how extremely, not only unlikely is it, I don't even know if it would be possible. Meaning, I don't, and if anyone's fearing this, I don't think it's possible. You can't make an executive order and say everyone can have abortion. So we know that can't happen. The only way you could ever have a change in abortion like that across all states would be, you would either have to have somehow a Supreme Court decision that said no one's allowed to have abortions, which would probably be impossible because they already said it's not a government issue. That's why I got sent back to states. Or Congress would have to pass that. And there's the filibuster. So there's no way that could happen, because even if, let's say, Republicans did go crazy and tried to do that, it's impossible, because you would be able to filibuster it and it would never happen. So I don't even see a way that could happen. So I know people are, you know, worried about this national abortion ban, but it's actually not even possible to happen unless all of a sudden Democrats came to the side and said, yeah, we want it too. Then that could happen. So I'd love to see what your thought is that. And then the second one is, I go back to that question about the IVF, but we'll get to that one next.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this stuff is like, it's so fascinating. And, you know, I'm not even going to try to pretend to understand constitutional law and, you know, how you get these things going. But I will say a couple things, again, just like as a very, like, my little perspective as a fertility doctor is, the first thing that we're seeing that's great for women's rights and women's health is people are voting to allow for things that make sense to take care of women when they need the care of a termination, when they need the care of helping them get through a miscarriage, you know, so that these things that are very unfortunate, like what happened to a young woman in Texas, doesn't happen again. And the proof is in the pudding, right? Like, listen, we had a Republican president just voted in, but 7 of 10 states also passed reproductive rights laws, and a big one of them was right here in Arizona.
Yep.
Prop 139, astoundingly passed. To say, hey, we're going to protect women's right to abortion until viability. So again, I think that we're seeing something that maybe is changing over time, where you have, traditionally you've had these two things that happen in lockstep. You have, kind of Republican candidates that always say, yes, anti-abortion and all these things. But what we're seeing, for example, here in Arizona, is we're seeing voters that probably voted for Trump and voted for Prop 139 to be passed. That's I think what a lot of the, at least political pundits, are saying. And so I think this is a step in the right direction for women's rights, that both sides of political leanings are coming together on this idea of protecting women's rights. And as a result, I think and that's probably the most controversial one, is abortion rights. So when we start thinking about IVF, embryo creation, all these other things, I think the laws are gonna all veer in that direction even more so. And so I think while there were some concerns for a minute with what happened in Alabama, and the IVF concerns that happened there very quickly, I think what we've seen is the pendulum swing all the way back and say, hey, people want this, people want IVF, people want family building. America is very pro-family, so why would we mess with something that's pro-family? And I think that's really what it comes down to. I think it's really as simple as that. I personally am not seeing, the writing on the wall that we're going to go back in that other direction against abortion rights, let's say. Now, I know there's a lot more work to be done. There's three other states that voted against it, et cetera. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on these propositions that passed and kind of where we're at with that?
I completely agree with you. I would even make the argument the pendulum swung earlier. I think that politics made this a hot issue, but really the pendulum swung a lot earlier. And the reason I say that is because, I think one of the arguments people had is they didn't like the idea of government telling them you have to allow abortions, right? So when they allowed it to go to states, I feel like what it did is it allowed the people who were frustrated with the government oversight said, okay, that's gone, right? And you can't argue with a state, right? If the people of the state say they want it. And as you said, think of Arizona. Like, we don't consider Arizona super, super conservative, but it's still a conservative state. And yet it passed, like you said, with flying colors, which is interesting because we already had abortion in our state up to 15 weeks. So it wasn't like we didn't have abortions in our state. And what's interesting about that is if you even look at the country in general, the belief was that most people were comfortable with about up to 15 weeks. And yet that thing just passed perfect. The thing that's interesting to me about that is that a lot of people don't realize this. In the rest of the world, they don't even allow that. Most of the world does not allow up to viability. Most of the countries, UK, stuff like that, are like 15 weeks and that's it. So when you really want to think about it and you go, wow, our country is so conservative about this, we're actually not. And I think that pendulum is swinging because the reason I say is because when Alabama happened, a lot of people don't realize no law was passed. So when Alabama happened, Alabama was a issue with a law that was on the books from a long time ago. And unfortunately, it was an interpretation by a judge. But it wasn't like when that happened that the Republicans said, yay. It was actually the opposite. Republicans, Democrats, everyone, and Trump himself said, that needs to be fixed tomorrow. And within a week, it was resolved. And that's why I said that I think the pendulum swung a while ago. And what we're seeing now is so great to see the states and people voting is it's just showing that it's changed. The thought. Now, it doesn't mean people don't dislike it still. It just means that people realize that there's a need for it. Let's say that. So then it gets to the question of IVF, right? Is it possible? Could Trump or whoever stop IVF? Could they get to that point where we're talking about personhood laws now, right? Where you make it where IVF isn't even allowed, you can't even freeze embryos, and so we do have examples of this in other countries. So this is where we talked about before. I think it was in Spain where you couldn't freeze embryos, and even actually in most countries you still can't freeze embryos for research. But the question is there a possibility? Could it really happen? I think you and I have talked about this. I don't think so. I don't think that our country, if you look at what just happened in most of these states, and I do believe all 50 states will eventually have abortion laws passed. You know, they may not all be to viability, they may not all be to, to full term, but the point is, I think they will all have some laws on there because I see the pendulum swinging. Um, I just can't see a situation where IVF would be stopped because if that's okay, why would the majority then not want IVF? That's never really been a hot topic. So I just feel like there's no issue with that. I'd love to see what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, again, I think this is one of those topics that seems to really be, something politicians can agree on, right? And they're, whether Democrats or Republicans or further on the right or further on the left than that, I think most everybody is saying, hey, this makes sense to help people who can't have a family have a family. And by the way, this is nothing crazy. Like the World Health Organization recognizes infertility as a disease, and it's a human right to be able to have a family. Now, it's not a human right to be able to get IVF, but I think that we're falling in lockstep with just people's general beliefs around this. And I think there was a minute where people just needed a second to understand, what is IVF, how does it work? People definitely have a lot of questions about it, and those things are very interesting. Now, what I could imagine happening over time, and again, it just depends on how the legislation gets written and what's covered, is some of these things that you talked about. Are we trying to help you have just one child or all of your children? Is sex selection going to be allowed? I mean, that's a controversial one because, there's a lot that goes into that. Genetic testing, our ability to do very sophisticated genetic testing 10, 15 years from today is going to look very different. And they're going to have to anticipate that, and, what's going to be allowed and what's not going to be allowed. And if there is some government, play here where they're writing legislation to allow or pay for it, you better believe they're going to have a say in that.
Yeah, and going back to some of the economics we were talking about, I mean, the pharmacies are loving this, right? They're going to love this. They're absolutely, and you got these big corporations now. A lot of the fertility places are no longer private practices like us. They're these huge conglomerates, and they're just looking at the dollar signs. And so, I mean, again, it's going to be really interesting when this happens. How does the economics change it? What happens to the field? It's coming. There's no question. It will happen. I think within the next 5 years, we will have a national mandate. I'm not even shocked that will happen. It's just the question is, what will be the iterations of it? Because if you look at Massachusetts and you look at Illinois, completely different.
Ooh,
and what's really interesting,
5 years, Dr. Amos, I'm willing to take a bet right here. I don't think it's going to be 5 years, but I like it.
I think I'll take that bet. I think it's 5 years. I think so. Yeah.
All right, I like it.
The one thing that's interesting, though, is, and this is a part that a lot of people may not realize, is that it has to be a company that's in your state. So what that means is California can't have, let's say, for example, you work for a company in Arizona, but you live in California. They will not be mandated to have to provide fertility insurance. And that happens to a lot of people like in Illinois, that they work for, let's say, a neighboring state, but they live in Illinois, and then they don't get the coverage, even though they live there. And so it's just one of those things. These are these little nuances that, we don't think about at times. But yeah, I think in summary, for people who came here to figure out, like, oh my God, am I not going to be able to go through IVF? Am I going to have to worry about my embryos? The one thing I can tell you is every clinic has thought about this already. Everyone has a backup plan if anything ever happened. But if there's anything that we've seen, even a red state like Arizona just passed abortion to allow up to viability. So it shows the pendulum swung. I don't think it's something that we're going to have to worry about here. And I think after a year, this is going to be like a topic that doesn't get brought up much. Egg freezing, like we said, sperm freezing, not an issue. And then we're hoping, I'm saying 5 years, we'll find out if I win the bet. And I'm assuming you're saying longer, right? Not shorter.
I think longer. I think longer before a federal mandate that allows for it. And I'll take you out to a nice steak dinner if I lose
Okay.
this
I'm everyone heard this, so I'm gonna call him out on that steak dinner if around. But I feel like it's gonna happen. Let's we got Dakota here who has been on before, and you know, I know he loves politics as well. So I'm definitely interested in Dakota's you know, view and any questions he may have about this.
Hey, gentlemen. So first of all, and I just added it to the chat, the tomahawks at Bourbon and Bones are great. So those are market price though, Dr. Salem. So it'll be nice.
You put me up to it. So all right, that'll be market price in 5 or 6 years. So we'll find out.
So about $5,000
Right,
in about 5 or 6 years with current inflation. So yeah, I mean, the biggest thing kind of going on with your guys' bet is, what are you guys hearing the pushback really be? As Dr. Amol stated, I'm involved in politics to an extent. I'm also involved in religious groups. And funny enough, even the little bit of pushback I hear from religious groups, I'm able to change their mind pretty quickly with Jeremiah 1:5, you know, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Because a lot of times I get pushback religious, oh, you know, life starts at conception. I'm like, well, you're assuming conception that necessarily means fertilization. And if you look at Jeremiah 1:5, you could actually make the argument is conception equals fertilization plus implantation. And that's the argument that I always make is, so is it just a religious pushback? Because I'm curious, because I really don't hear that much pushback on implementing this federally.
So I can tell you that there is definitely some religious pushback. Okay, one group that is huge when religious pushback is going to be Catholicism, right? I mean, it's actually not even allowed in Catholicism to do IVF. A lot of times when I see patients who are Catholic, you know, they don't want anyone to know. So that is one group, and that's no different than when it comes like the birth control, right? So the same thing. You know, we had the same thing with Obama when they did make you know, birth control mandatory. Insurance had to cover it. There was that big push, and a lot of assurances are from Christian organizations, right? So there is that pushback, and there's also that, you know, that legal issue of state, you know, versus church. And so how do you take something like IVF that an entire religion doesn't allow, and then say, but now you have to offer it? So that is one of the biggest pushbacks that I see. Personal pushback, I agree with you. I don't think that's ever like a personal religious thing is not a big thing. I see the same. I think it's God works through us to do this. So I'm like, if God didn't want us to do this, he wouldn't have allowed us to do this. So I agree with you on that. But
and I guess all Catholics are different. I know some Catholics and they've changed their mind on it because they go, we need babies, and people that want to have babies are great. And hey, let's have babies and let's support the doctors that want to help us make babies.
But that's more on the individual standpoint. Like I said, on the larger standpoint, when you talk about lobbyists and things like that, it is still a big pushback. The second thing I would bring up too is the economics. I mean, like I said, I mean, you're talking, we don't even know what the numbers would be, because remember, these are people who may come out from the woodworks that would never have done IVF. Now, you know, it gets higher. How does that affect well,
I smiled when Dr. Salem said $9 billion, and I'm like, that's all? Like, I think the government sneezes and they throw that money away every single time. So,
but they do. But the thing when it comes to stuff like that is, remember, once you pass something like that, right? How do you take it away? Right? Like when we make Medicare, like, how do you take it away? So if it ever blooms up too big, how do you get rid of it? And I think sometimes we forget how big a billion is. I think we forget how big a trillion is. One of my favorite things I love to ask people is do they know how long a million seconds are? And for most people who don't know that, a million seconds is around like 13, 14 days. The question is, how long is a billion seconds? And what's interesting is 32 years. Okay. And a trillion seconds would put you at 32,000 years. And so, yeah, those are big differences. And so, yeah, they seem small in the way they throw around numbers and, like you said, throw around things, but it's pretty big. And right now, obviously, there is an issue with spending too much. And so, I'm still going for within 5 years. I want that tomahawk steak, but I'd love to see what Dr. Salem says about that. What are your thoughts on those things he said?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think probably our biggest I think our biggest hurdle right now for a federally covered insurance would be cost. I think we're in a record deficit levels. Government spending is a lot of people have voted to say that government spending has really ballooned, right? So is adding one more program like this within their budget? I don't know. Maybe not. But my guess is probably not.
Well, the funny thing is, Dr. Salem, is if you actually look at that, is people say, yes, the government spends too much money, but then when you pull them on individual items, is should they cut back on this thing? They say no. And it's
Right.
like,
Right. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Now, I think the more plausible, more likely thing is they could pass. So one is that we could see a bunch of different state mandates where each state governs this. And I think that's actually more likely. I think where each state says, yep, you need to have an IVF mandate in Arizona, you need to have an IVF mandate in California, and every state does it a little bit differently, just like what's happening with abortion right now. I think a federal mandate could happen, but then you have to make sure that you're not doing something too harsh on a state that isn't quite as well off, let's call it, as a state that's very well off, right? And so you have to kind of be careful about how you do that. And so I do think it'll come through on the state level, and it's going to be kind of patchwork, just like we've seen so many of these things over recent years. And I think what's going to be a big difference between the different states is how rich is the coverage, right? So, some states, their coverage might say lifetime $5,000. Other states might say 3 retrievals, unlimited transfers. And those are hugely different things.
So does Dr. Ramoles get a handicap then? So if 40 states individually pass it at the state level, that also counts for his.
I'm good for it. I'll do that.
So federal or 40 states. Yeah, there we go.
Exactly. I do think there's also one other part, which is the constitutionality of it. I mean, if you look at like when Biden wanted to get rid of academic loans and stuff like that, right? There's always pushback in these things, and people fought for a while, and I think there will be some pushback. I think if they try to do it, it has to go through legislation, basically. So what it has to do, and if they can get it through legislation, then representation from everybody, and they'll go. But I truly feel like we have a problem in this country of not having enough kids. We actually need more kids, and
more kids equals more taxpayers eventually.
Yeah. Exactly. So we actually make more money as a country with having more people. And so I don't know. I really do see it. Like I said, I've seen the path. I really think 5 years, and my tomahawk steak should be coming here in about the next 4 or 5 years. So Dakota, thanks so much. Like I said, I knew you were in the background. Thought we'll bring up when it's the perfect time. Thanks so much, man, for coming on.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for your perspective too. It's always nice hearing the different perspectives, and there was really nice hearing Dakota's kind of, marrying some of the religious kind of philosophy and, as well as the political. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I mean, this is such an interesting topic. I mean, it's the reason I think it will get pushed is I honestly feel like Trump is so egotistical in the fact that he likes, that kind of like I did this. I just see him like really pushing it to be like, see, I told you I'd do it. Like, maybe he won't, but like I said, I feel like he wants the pride of it. And so for me, I'm excited because I'm like, hey, I hope he does it, because this is something I've wanted for a long time too. I just hope with the iterations of it that it actually is good, because I've seen many people have fertility insurance that is just horrible.
Yeah.
And so we have this one group in town that gets a $2,000 maximum. Like, what does that do? That's not even fertility coverage, but they technically could say that they provide fertility coverage. So,
right.
Anyways, I see we have one question before we go. I know it said, I did IVF at your clinic today in Glendale. Well, we're not in Glendale. That's very interesting. So it was a question I was seeing on there about for fertility. I think they were just saying that it was a wild day or something like that. But anyways, anything you want to leave off on?
No, I think maybe like just as a little remark. I mean, I think this is fantastic that we can have this dialogue, right? Like, I think this is in large part, why the democracy hopefully works so well. And it's that we can have this dialogue and say, hey, what's good about covering IVF coverage? What's bad about covering IVF coverage? Is there a best way to do it? And by getting all these things out, you get hopefully different stakeholders involved. And a key stakeholder are the patients. And we know we have to keep our patients at the table in this conversation. So again, I'm just so happy that people are like coming on, they're talking about this, they're voicing their concerns about it. Please continue to do that, because we might see this legislation, if it's, in the next couple of few years, and Dr. Amos gets his tomahawk steak, I want you to be at the table having this conversation, with politicians, with, legislators, et cetera. And so really happy about all the enthusiasm around this topic today.
And really, we should push it, right? I mean, listen, we had a presidential candidate, 2 of them say they're going to do this. We should hold them to it. And we really should be writing to them and telling them that, hey, follow through on this, and I really hope it does come through. And not just because I want my tomahawk steak, but because I want everyone to have coverage. So, hey, thanks for coming on again tonight, man, and doing this with me. I look forward to talking to you here in a couple of weeks. We have a very, very special guest who's going to be coming on with us. And so we'll be kind of telling everyone about it here soon, but she's a very famous TikTok star, a dear friend of mine who is a reproductive doctor from Illinois. And so we're gonna be excited to bring her on, and we'll have some extra people here next time. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.